The crimson stains that Detective Laura Johnson discovered, splattered across the white marble floor of the luxury Orlando apartment, told a story of violence that had erupted within hours of what was supposed to be a celebration of new love. As 25-year-old Pooja Desai lay unconscious with severe head trauma inflicted by her husband Arjun Mehta, after he discovered she was not the virgin bride he had demanded as a condition of their arranged marriage, Pooja had arrived at Orlando International Airport just 72 hours earlier as a hopeful young woman clutching her new American visa and dreaming of building a successful marriage with the charismatic real estate agent whose family had carefully negotiated their union through traditional matchmaking processes that emphasized compatibility, education, and moral character above romantic attraction or personal chemistry. The cultural expectations that surrounded their wedding ceremony included ancient traditions about female purity that transformed Pooja's previous relationship with her college boyfriend Rohit into an unforgivable betrayal in Arjun's mind, despite the fact that her intimate relationship had been consensual and loving rather than the shameful corruption that traditionalist interpretations of Hindu marriage customs condemned in unmarried women. The violence that erupted in their honeymoon suite at the Grand Bohemian Hotel was witnessed by neighboring guests who heard screaming and crashing sounds through the walls, though none immediately recognized the sounds as evidence of domestic assault rather than passionate intimacy between newlyweds who were expected to consummate their marriage with enthusiasm and devotion. The medical examination that followed Pooja's emergency hospitalization revealed extensive injuries consistent with prolonged physical assault, including fractured ribs, internal bleeding, and traumatic brain injury that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent neurological damage from the repeated blows that Arjun had inflicted during his rage about discovering her lack of virginity. The investigation that Detective Johnson initiated uncovered a pattern of obsessive behavior regarding female purity that had characterized Arjun's approach to dating and marriage for years, with former girlfriends describing his invasive questions about their sexual histories and his tendency to become violent when women failed to meet his impossible standards of moral perfection. The family dynamics that had enabled Arjun's abusive mindset included traditional patriarchal values that his father Sanjay had reinforced throughout his childhood, teaching him that women's worth depended entirely on their sexual purity, and that any deviation from traditional expectations justified severe punishment to restore family, honor, and masculine authority. The community pressure that complicated the investigation reflected broader tensions within the Indian American immigrant population between preserving cultural heritage and adapting to American legal standards that protected women's rights to personal autonomy and freedom from violence, regardless of their previous relationships or perceived moral failures. The medical team that treated Pooja's injuries included specialists who recognized the systematic nature of domestic violence, while also understanding the cultural factors that might prevent her from cooperating with law enforcement agencies that could provide protection and justice if she was willing to testify against her husband, despite family pressure to maintain silence. The evidence that accumulated during the investigation painted a picture of premeditated violence based on culturally conditioned expectations about marriage and sexuality that had transformed what should have been an intimate moment of connection into a brutal assault that nearly claimed Pooja's life while exposing the dangerous intersection of tradition and misogyny. The cultural shame that surrounded the case created additional barriers for Pooja's recovery, as her family in Mumbai struggled to balance concern for her physical welfare with anxiety about the scandal that her situation would create within their social community, where divorced or abused women faced permanent stigma and reduced marriage prospects. The courtship between Pooja Desai and Arjun Mehta was orchestrated entirely through family intermediaries who exchanged detailed biographical information while emphasizing the prospective groom's successful real estate career and bride's prestigious degree in hospitality management from a respected Mumbai university, with both families viewing the arrangement as an ideal merger of compatible educational and economic backgrounds. The background verification process that preceded their engagement included extensive inquiries into both families' social standing, financial stability, and moral reputation within their respective communities, though these investigations focused primarily on public behavior and professional achievements, rather than personal values or psychological compatibility that might predict marital harmony. The religious consultation that was conducted before finalizing their marriage agreement involved traditional astrologers who analyzed birth charts and planetary alignments to ensure cosmic compatibility, while also confirming that both participants met cultural requirements for moral purity and spiritual readiness to fulfill their dharmic obligations as married householders. The engagement ceremony that took place in Mumbai during October 2023 was attended by over 200 guests who celebrated what appeared to be an exemplary match between families of comparable social status, though Pooja's nervousness and reluctance to participate in traditional rituals were attributed to natural shyness rather than anxiety about concealing her previous relationship. The visa application process that brought Pooja to Florida was expedited through Arjun's established American citizenship and his family's connections within the Indian American business community, with immigration officials having no reason to question the legitimacy of an arranged marriage that followed traditional patterns of family negotiation and cultural matching. The prenuptial expectations that Arjun communicated through his family included explicit demands for a virgin bride who would dedicate herself completely to his career advancement and family obligations, with clear warnings that any deception about her moral purity would constitute grounds for immediate annulment and public humiliation that would destroy her reputation permanently. The financial arrangements that accompanied their marriage included substantial gifts from both families and the establishment of joint bank accounts that Arjun controlled completely, creating immediate economic dependence that would prevent Pooja from maintaining independence if their relationship encountered difficulties or if she needed to escape dangerous situations. The cultural preparation that Pooja received from her mother Rita included detailed instructions about wifely duties and the importance of maintaining harmony through submission and patience, with explicit warnings that any complaints about her husband's behavior would bring shame upon their family's reputation within Mumbai's traditional Hindu community. The apartment that Arjun had selected for their married life was located in Orlando's upscale Thornton Park neighborhood, chosen specifically to impress his professional associates and community members who would judge his success by his ability to provide luxury accommodations for his traditional Indian wife, who represented his commitment to cultural values. The social integration that Arjun planned for Pooja included carefully controlled introductions to other Indian American couples who shared traditional values about gender roles and family hierarchy, with the expectation that she would find friendship and support among women who had successfully adapted to American life while maintaining cultural authenticity. The psychological pressure that Pooja experienced during her final weeks in Mumbai included increasing anxiety about her ability to maintain the deception about her virginity, while also dealing with family expectations that she would quickly establish herself as the perfect daughter-in-law who would enhance Arjun's reputation within their immigrant community. The wedding ceremony that took place at the Grand Bohemian Hotel in Orlando included traditional Hindu rituals that emphasized the bride's transformation from daughter to wife, with elaborate symbolism about purity and devotion that intensified Pooja's guilt about her secret, while also creating unrealistic expectations about her capacity for immediate, intimate connection with her new husband. The honeymoon night that was supposed to celebrate the beginning of Pooja and Arjun's married life began with traditional rituals in their hotel suite, including the sharing of milk and sweets that symbolized the sweetness of their union, though the atmosphere quickly became tense when Arjun's expectations for physical intimacy revealed his obsessive focus on confirming his bride's virginity through invasive examination. The confrontation that erupted when Arjun discovered the absence of physical evidence supporting Pooja's claimed purity involved accusations of deception and moral corruption delivered in both English and Hindi, with his rage escalating rapidly from verbal abuse to physical violence, as he interpreted her previous relationship as a deliberate betrayal of their marriage contract. The violence that Arjun inflicted began with slapping and escalated to punching and kicking, as Pooja's attempts to explain the circumstances of her college relationship with Rohit were dismissed as additional lies that compounded her original sin of entering marriage under false pretenses that had humiliated him before God and their families. The physical assault that continued for approximately 30 minutes included systematic beatings that targeted Pooja's head and torso, while Arjun screamed about his ruined reputation and the impossibility of presenting a defiled wife to his family and community members who had been promised a pure bride worthy of their elevated social status. The desperate attempts that Pooja made to defend herself were hampered by her unfamiliarity with American emergency services and her cultural conditioning to accept male authority even in dangerous situations, though her screams for help eventually attracted the attention of neighboring hotel guests who recognized the sounds of violence rather than intimacy. The neighbor who ultimately called 911 was Maria Lopez, a Puerto Rican businesswoman staying in the adjacent suite who had initially dismissed the sounds as passionate newlywed activity, but became concerned when the screaming continued for an extended period and took on increasingly desperate characteristics that suggested genuine distress rather than pleasure. The police response that arrived at the Grand Bohemian Hotel within 12 minutes included officers trained in domestic violence intervention, though they initially faced resistance from hotel management, who were reluctant to acknowledge violent incidents that might damage their reputation as a luxury destination for romantic celebrations and special events. The crime scene that Detective Johnson encountered revealed extensive blood evidence and signs of prolonged struggle throughout the suite, with broken furniture, torn clothing, and personal belongings scattered in patterns consistent with systematic domestic assault rather than the accident or consensual rough play that Arjun initially claimed to explain his wife's injuries. The medical emergency that required immediate ambulance transport was complicated by Pooja's fluctuating consciousness and her inability to provide coherent statements about the circumstances of her injuries, though her physical condition clearly indicated severe trauma that required urgent surgical intervention to prevent permanent neurological damage. The arrest of Arjun was initially for aggravated domestic violence, though the charges would later be upgraded based on the severity of Pooja's injuries and evidence of premeditation that emerged during the investigation, into his psychological preparation for marriage and his documented obsession with female purity and traditional gender roles. The hospital treatment that Pooja received at Orlando Regional Medical Center included emergency surgery to relieve brain swelling and repair internal injuries, with medical staff noting that her injuries were consistent with prolonged assault by someone who understood how to inflict maximum damage while avoiding immediately fatal trauma. The initial investigation that Detective Johnson conducted included interviews with hotel staff, neighboring guests, and family members who could provide context for understanding the cultural factors that had contributed to the violent confrontation, while also establishing the legal framework for prosecuting domestic violence, regardless of cultural justifications. The medical documentation that accumulated during Pooja's hospitalization revealed the systematic nature of Arjun's assault, with forensic analysis confirming that her injuries had been inflicted by multiple blows delivered with increasing force over an extended period, indicating sustained rage rather than momentary loss of control that might have mitigated criminal liability. The forensic evidence collected from the hotel suite included DNA samples, fingerprint analysis, and photographic documentation of blood spatter patterns that contradicted Arjun's claims about accidental injury during consensual intimate activity, instead supporting prosecution arguments about premeditated violence triggered by cultural obsessions about female purity. The digital evidence recovered from Arjun's phone and computer revealed extensive internet research about traditional marriage customs, virginity testing methods, and legal consequences for marriage fraud, demonstrating calculated preparation for the confrontation that would occur when he discovered his bride's previous relationship through physical examination. The witness testimony that emerged from the investigation included statements from hotel guests who had heard the violent confrontation, medical personnel who treated Pooja's injuries, and family members who could provide background information about the cultural expectations that had motivated Arjun's obsessive behavior regarding his wife's sexual history. The psychological evaluation that was conducted as part of the legal proceedings revealed personality disorders and cultural conditioning that explained Arjun's capacity for systematic violence while maintaining a public facade of respectability, providing insight into the warning signs that might have protected Pooja if they had been recognized during their courtship period. The community response to Arjun's arrest included conflicting reactions within the Indian American population, with some members expressing sympathy for his alleged humiliation, while others condemned domestic violence regardless of the cultural circumstances that might have triggered male anger about female deception or perceived moral failures. The victim advocacy that emerged in support of Pooja included efforts by women's rights organizations to ensure that cultural considerations did not excuse or minimize the severity of domestic violence, while also providing education about resources available to immigrant women who might be trapped in abusive relationships or facing family pressure to remain silent. The media coverage of the case brought attention to the dangerous intersection of cultural traditions and domestic violence, highlighting the vulnerability of recent immigrants who might be isolated from support systems, while also facing pressure to maintain family honor through submission to abusive partners who exploited traditional gender roles. The legal strategy that the prosecution developed focused on the premeditated nature of Arjun's violence and his systematic preparation for discovering and punishing any deviation from his unrealistic expectations about female purity, while also addressing cultural factors that might influence jury perceptions without excusing criminal behavior. The defense team's approach attempted to minimize Arjun's culpability by emphasizing cultural factors that allegedly justified his emotional response to discovering his wife's alleged deception, while also questioning the severity of her injuries and suggesting that the assault had been less systematic than prosecution experts claimed. The family pressure that Pooja experienced during her recovery included phone calls from relatives in Mumbai who urged her to withdraw cooperation with law enforcement agencies and return to India, where the situation could be resolved through traditional mediation rather than American criminal justice proceedings that might create permanent scandal. The cultural consultation that was arranged for the legal proceedings included expert testimony about the significance of virginity within traditional Hindu marriage customs, while also explaining how these expectations could be exploited by abusive individuals to justify violence against women who failed to meet impossible standards of moral perfection. The trial of Arjun Mehta for aggravated domestic violence and attempted murder attracted significant media attention that highlighted the complex cultural dynamics surrounding arranged marriages and the ways that traditional expectations about female purity could be weaponized by abusive partners to justify systematic violence against vulnerable women. The prosecution's case was built around the premeditated nature of Arjun's assault and his documented obsession with virginity that had been communicated to his family and incorporated into their marriage negotiations as a non-negotiable requirement that would determine Pooja's acceptability as his wife and her worth as a member of their family. The testimony provided by Detective Johnson was crucial in establishing the timeline of events and the systematic nature of the evidence that contradicted Arjun's claims about accidental injury, with detailed forensic analysis demonstrating that Pooja's injuries were consistent with prolonged assault rather than the consensual activity that the defense attempted to suggest. The medical expert testimony that supported the prosecution included detailed analysis of Pooja's injuries and their consistency with systematic beating rather than accidental trauma, with physicians explaining how the pattern of wounds indicated calculated violence designed to inflict maximum pain and psychological damage while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. The victim impact statement that Pooja provided through video testimony from her hospital bed was emotionally devastating but legally essential for establishing the human cost of domestic violence, while also demonstrating her courage and challenging cultural expectations that discouraged women from seeking justice for intimate partner abuse. The defense strategy focused on cultural mitigation arguments that portrayed Arjun as a victim of overwhelming emotional trauma caused by discovering his wife's alleged deception about her moral purity, while also attempting to characterize the violent assault as an understandable response to extreme provocation rather than premeditated domestic violence. The expert testimony about cultural factors provided context for understanding the significance of virginity within traditional Hindu marriage customs without excusing or justifying violence against women who failed to meet these expectations, with careful distinction between cultural appreciation and cultural relativism that might minimize criminal accountability. The community testimony revealed complex dynamics within the Indian American immigrant population, with some witnesses supporting traditional values while others condemned domestic violence, regardless of the cultural circumstances that might have motivated male anger about female autonomy or perceived moral failures. The forensic evidence presentation included detailed analysis of the blood patterns, DNA samples, and physical evidence that contradicted defense claims about consensual activity, with expert testimony about the systematic nature of domestic violence and the ways that cultural factors could be exploited to justify and conceal abuse. The character testimony that was presented for both the victim and perpetrator revealed conflicting perceptions about their personalities and relationships with family members and community associates, providing different perspectives about their compatibility and the warning signs that might have predicted violence. The jury selection process required careful screening for potential bias regarding domestic violence and cultural factors, with detailed questioning about attitudes toward arranged marriage, traditional gender roles, and the relationship between cultural heritage and legal accountability for violent crimes. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on determining appropriate punishment that would reflect both the severity of Arjun's crimes and the cultural factors that had contributed to his violent behavior, while also considering the deterrent effect that might prevent similar violence within immigrant communities. The conviction of Arjun Mehta on charges of aggravated domestic violence and attempted murder resulted in a 25-year prison sentence that sent shockwaves through the Indian American community in Florida, forcing difficult conversations about the balance between cultural traditions and legal accountability, while highlighting the need for enhanced education about domestic violence prevention. The impact on Pooja's recovery was complicated by her traumatic brain injury and the ongoing effects of systematic abuse, with medical professionals providing specialized treatment for both physical injuries and psychological trauma, while also addressing cultural factors that might interfere with her healing and rehabilitation process. The community response included formation of support groups for Indian American women who might be experiencing domestic violence while lacking knowledge of available resources, with bilingual counselors and legal advocates working to bridge cultural gaps that often prevented victims from seeking help through American social service systems. The family dynamics that emerged following the trial were complex and painful, with Pooja's relatives in Mumbai struggling to balance pride in her courage with shame about the public exposure of intimate family matters that challenged traditional expectations about female submission and marital harmony within arranged marriage relationships. The policy implications of the case influenced law enforcement training about cultural sensitivity in domestic violence investigations, with enhanced protocols for recognizing warning signs of abuse within immigrant communities, where traditional gender roles and family structures might mask dangerous situations from outside observers. The victim advocacy that developed included establishment of memorial funds to support domestic violence prevention programs specifically designed for recent immigrants who might be isolated by language barriers, cultural unfamiliarity, and economic dependence on potentially abusive partners who exploited traditional values. The educational initiatives that emerged in response to the case provided information about warning signs of domestic violence while respecting cultural diversity and avoiding stereotypes about particular ethnic or religious communities that might discourage reporting or help-seeking behavior among vulnerable populations. The legal precedents established through Arjun's prosecution influenced how similar cases would be investigated and prosecuted in the future, with clear guidelines about the inadmissibility of cultural defenses that attempted to justify or minimize domestic violence against women who allegedly violated traditional expectations about purity or obedience. The international cooperation that facilitated the investigation included coordination with Indian authorities who provided background information about both families, while also raising awareness about domestic violence issues that affected immigrant women who might be vulnerable to abuse by partners who exploited cultural isolation and economic dependence. The psychological research that was inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of how cultural expectations about female purity could be exploited by abusive partners to justify systematic violence, while also advancing knowledge about effective intervention strategies that respected cultural diversity while providing genuine protection. The media coverage that continued following the trial brought sustained attention to the challenges faced by immigrant women in abusive relationships, highlighting the importance of culturally sensitive support services, while also emphasizing that traditional values could never justify violence against women who exercised personal autonomy. The ongoing impact on the Indian American community included enhanced awareness about domestic violence, resources, and legal protections available to all residents, regardless of immigration status, with community leaders working to ensure that cultural preservation did not endanger vulnerable women who needed protection from abusive partners. The establishment of support networks for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence grew from recognition that Pooja's case was not unique, with other recent brides facing similar situations involving cultural pressure about purity and submission that made them vulnerable to abuse by partners who exploited traditional expectations about female behavior within marriage relationships. The research initiatives that were funded through victim advocacy organizations contributed to enhanced understanding of the specific vulnerabilities faced by women in arranged marriages, particularly those who immigrated to foreign countries where their lack of independent social connections created opportunities for systematic abuse and control by partners who understood cultural manipulation techniques. The legislative advocacy that emerged from the case included efforts to strengthen domestic violence protections for immigrant women, improve cultural competency training for law enforcement and social service providers, and enhance coordination between agencies that might encounter victims who were reluctant to seek help due to shame or family pressure. The educational programs that were developed to raise awareness about domestic violence in immigrant communities included culturally sensitive materials that provided information about legal rights and available resources, while respecting religious and traditional values that were important to community members who might otherwise be reluctant to engage with mainstream social services. The international cooperation initiatives that were supported by victim advocates included enhanced information sharing between countries about individuals with histories of domestic violence, improved protocols for investigating cases that involved cultural factors, and strengthened diplomatic cooperation for addressing systemic issues that endangered immigrant women. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed for survivors of culturally motivated domestic violence addressed the unique trauma associated with intimate partner abuse that exploited traditional values, while also providing specialized approaches for rebuilding self-worth and autonomy after experiencing systematic devaluation and control. The technology initiatives that were prompted by the case included development of multilingual resources for domestic violence prevention and response, enhanced communication systems that could overcome language barriers, and improved coordination between databases that might help identify patterns of abuse across different cultural communities. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to the case provided specialized assistance for immigrant women while also offering practical guidance for navigating complex legal and social service systems that were often difficult to access without appropriate cultural and linguistic support from trained advocates. The ongoing monitoring of domestic violence patterns revealed that immigrant women faced unique risks related to cultural isolation and economic dependence, with particular attention to the ways that traditional expectations about female purity and submission could be exploited by abusive partners for systematic control and violence. The policy development that resulted from the case included enhanced training requirements for professionals who worked with immigrant populations, improved coordination between agencies that provided services to domestic violence victims, and strengthened accountability measures for addressing cultural factors that might interfere with effective protection. The academic research that was inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of the intersection between culture and domestic violence, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies that respected cultural diversity while providing genuine protection for women who might be vulnerable to intimate partner abuse. The community partnerships that were established between traditional ethnic organizations and mainstream domestic violence service providers created new opportunities for outreach and support, while also addressing cultural barriers that had previously prevented effective collaboration between communities that shared goals of protecting vulnerable women. The long-term impact of Pooja's case on domestic violence prevention efforts within immigrant communities extended far beyond immediate policy changes, to include fundamental shifts in how cultural traditions were discussed and preserved, with community leaders recognizing the need to distinguish between valuable heritage and harmful practices that endangered vulnerable women. The recovery process that Pooja experienced was lengthy and complex, involving physical rehabilitation for her traumatic brain injury, as well as psychological therapy to address the trauma of domestic violence and cultural betrayal, with specialized treatment that recognized the intersection of medical needs and cultural factors that influenced her healing journey. The educational impact of the case reached thousands of individuals through community programs, online resources, and media coverage that provided practical information about recognizing and responding to domestic violence, while also reducing stigma associated with seeking help from law enforcement and social service agencies. The policy changes that resulted from sustained advocacy included enhanced verification procedures for marriage-based immigration cases, improved training for cultural competency among service providers, and strengthened coordination between agencies that might encounter immigrant women experiencing domestic violence or cultural abuse. The technological solutions that were developed in response to the case included better systems for detecting and preventing domestic violence within immigrant communities, enhanced communication networks for reporting suspected abuse, and improved databases for sharing information about individuals with histories of culturally motivated violence. The corporate partnerships that were established enabled legitimate cultural organizations to implement better education and support systems for recent immigrants, while also providing resources for identifying and addressing domestic violence that might be disguised as traditional discipline or cultural expectations about marriage relationships. The international cooperation agreements that were negotiated as a result of the case facilitated beneficial collaboration between countries while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balanced respect for cultural diversity with fundamental human rights protections for vulnerable women who might be at risk of domestic violence. The ongoing investigation into patterns of culturally motivated domestic violence revealed systemic issues that required comprehensive approaches involving traditional community leaders, religious authorities, and modern social service providers working together to protect vulnerable women while preserving valuable cultural heritage. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed through advocacy research provided specialized approaches for helping survivors recover from domestic violence that exploited cultural expectations, while also addressing the complex trauma associated with betrayal by intimate partners and cultural communities that failed to provide protection. The legislative achievements that resulted from sustained advocacy work included enhanced penalties for domestic violence that exploited cultural factors, improved victim compensation programs, and strengthened protection for witnesses who testified against community members who had previously been able to intimidate or silence potential accusers. The victim support services that were expanded provided comprehensive assistance for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence, while also offering specialized resources for families dealing with cultural shame and community pressure that might complicate recovery and healing processes. The community outreach programs that were implemented reached thousands of recent immigrants through education about domestic violence prevention and available resources, while also providing training for community leaders who might encounter women in need of protection from abusive partners who exploited cultural expectations. The 10-year anniversary of Pooja's assault marked a significant milestone in ongoing efforts to prevent culturally motivated domestic violence within immigrant communities, with comprehensive programs that had directly assisted over 4,000 women, while also contributing to policy changes that enhanced protection for vulnerable populations across multiple states. The research initiatives that continued to emerge from the case advanced understanding of how cultural expectations about female purity could be weaponized by abusive partners, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about effective intervention strategies that respected cultural diversity while providing genuine protection for vulnerable women. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been developed for addressing domestic violence cases involving cultural factors evolved into permanent frameworks for sharing information and coordinating responses, with specialized units that understood cultural dynamics while maintaining focus on fundamental human rights and legal protections. The victim support services that had been enhanced in response to Pooja's case continued to provide specialized assistance for immigrant women, while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective support systems that helped survivors rebuild their lives after experiencing culturally motivated domestic violence. The educational initiatives that had grown out of the case continued to reach new populations through programs that provided culturally sensitive information about domestic violence prevention, while also raising awareness about available resources and legal protections for all residents, regardless of cultural background or immigration status. The policy changes that had been achieved through sustained advocacy continued to influence law enforcement procedures and victim protection measures, while also establishing legal precedents for prosecuting domestic violence cases that involved cultural manipulation or exploitation of traditional values by abusive partners. The technological solutions that had been developed continued to provide enhanced protection for immigrant women while also supporting legitimate cultural organizations that needed to balance traditional values with appropriate safeguards against domestic violence and other forms of culturally motivated abuse. The community partnerships that had been established continued to produce innovative approaches to domestic violence prevention, while also providing resources for organizations that needed to address cultural factors without compromising the safety of vulnerable women who might be experiencing abuse disguised as traditional expectations. The international cooperation agreements that had been negotiated continued to facilitate beneficial collaboration between countries, while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balanced respect for cultural heritage with fundamental human rights protections for women who might be vulnerable to domestic violence. The ongoing monitoring of domestic violence patterns revealed that while specific cases like Pooja's had generated important policy changes, similar situations continued to occur within immigrant communities where traditional practices and modern legal protections sometimes created complex challenges for victims and service providers. The psychological treatment protocols that had been developed continued to provide specialized approaches for helping survivors recover from culturally motivated domestic violence, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by communities whose traditional values might be exploited by abusive individuals. The legislative achievements that had resulted from advocacy efforts continued to influence policy development while also providing frameworks for international cooperation that enhanced protection for vulnerable women while supporting legitimate cultural practices that did not endanger individual safety and well-being. 15 years after Pooja Desai arrived in Orlando, believing she was beginning a new life of opportunity and love in America, only to become a victim of domestic violence, when her husband discovered she was not the virgin bride he had demanded as a condition of their arranged marriage. Her story continues to serve as both a stark reminder of the dangers of cultural extremism and an inspiring example of survival and advocacy. The Pooja Desai Foundation for Immigrant Women's Safety has become an internationally recognized institution that has directly assisted over 6,000 immigrant women while also funding research and policy initiatives that have contributed to systematic improvements in domestic violence prevention, cultural competency training, and victim protection services for vulnerable populations. The legislative changes that her advocacy helped achieve have been adopted across numerous jurisdictions and have contributed to more effective prosecution of culturally motivated domestic violence, while also providing enhanced resources for victims and their families who need support navigating complex legal systems and recovery processes. The international cooperation that was essential for addressing the cultural dimensions of her case has evolved into permanent frameworks for combating domestic violence within immigrant communities, with specialized units sharing intelligence and coordinating operations that have prevented numerous tragedies while establishing protocols for protecting vulnerable women. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to her case continue to provide specialized assistance for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence, while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective therapeutic interventions that help survivors rebuild their capacity for trust and healthy relationships. The technological innovations that have resulted from foundation-funded research continue to provide enhanced domestic violence detection and prevention capabilities, while also supporting legitimate cultural organizations that need to balance traditional values with appropriate safeguards against abuse and exploitation of vulnerable women. The educational initiatives that have grown out of Pooja's case continue to reach thousands of immigrant families through programs that provide practical information about domestic violence prevention while also challenging harmful interpretations of cultural traditions that endanger women's safety and dignity. The relationship that Pooja eventually built with trauma counselor Dr. Michael Rodriguez, whom she married 5 years after her recovery, demonstrated that healing and authentic love were possible even after experiencing devastating betrayal, though their relationship required careful development and ongoing commitment to mutual respect and equality. The ongoing impact of her advocacy work extends beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in cultural competency, victim support, and domestic violence prevention that continue to evolve in response to new challenges while maintaining focus on fundamental human rights that transcend cultural boundaries. The story of Puja Desai serves as a permanent reminder that while cultural traditions represent valuable heritage that deserves respect and preservation, these traditions must never be used to justify violence or exploitation of vulnerable individuals who deserve safety and dignity regardless of their personal histories. Her legacy lives on through the thousands of women who have been protected by the awareness programs her advocacy made possible, the hundreds of families who have received support through foundation services, and the systematic improvements in law enforcement and victim protection that emerged from comprehensive response to her near-fatal assault, ensuring that her suffering was ultimately transformed into lasting positive change that continues to benefit vulnerable individuals and families worldwide.